There comes a time in the course of human events when the political will of the people demands that it sever the ties that have bound it to another. This is not one of those times. I just want to read from this book by Wolfgang Smith called Science and Myth. I wanted to read from a chapter called Science and Epistemic Closure because I think it speaks to the underlying meta issue of the series of blogs that I've exchanged with Steve Ramirez, the PhD candidate in neuroscience at MIT. This meta issue is the relationship between science and philosophy. And Smith writes in this chapter, with the help of a French philosopher, Jean Borella, about the way that the relationship between science and philosophy has changed throughout human history. In the ancient period, philosophy was foundational. In the modern period, philosophy seems to be the handmaiden of science. And what Smith is calling epistemic closure seems to have a lot to do with how it is that science came to usurp philosophy as the foundational structure of or method of knowing, or way of being even, that undergirds our civilization. So this is chapter 3, Science and Epistemic Closure. In the preceding chapter, we have been concerned with the so-called de-essentialization of the world wrought by the empirometric, the empirical and measuring enterprise, and have uncovered a hidden nexus between bona fide science and what may be termed scientistic belief. We propose now to consider that de-essentialization, or the removal of all quality from nature by way of the reduction to quantity. That's what de-essentialization, in the sense that Smith is using it, means. We propose now to consider that de-essentialization and the concomitant emergence of scientistic belief in light of the French philosopher Jean Borella's magisterial study of symbolism. Centered specifically upon language and thought as such, Borella's opus embodies a philosophical point of view that enables one to survey the aforesaid phenomena in terms of a single conception, what he terms epistemic closure, which at one stroke lays bare the imperative of de-essentialization and of that nexus between science and myth, which stands at the center of our quest. In the first part of this chapter, I will place before the reader the aforesaid conception, following which I propose to consider some of its major implications for the philosophy of science, with special reference to modern physics. It may be well to begin with a few words concerning the distinguished French scholar whose doctrine has inspired the present chapter. A born philosopher, he has himself characterized his bent as instinctively Platonist. By the time he became acquainted with the writings of René Guénon during his college years, he perceived the Guénonian doctrine as an exposition of the Platonist metaphysics such as I discovered in myself, quote unquote. Due perhaps to the influence of Guénon, the young philosopher acquired an intimate knowledge of Eastern metaphysical doctrines, without, however, becoming alienated from his Western roots. These, too, he discovered and embraced, as he himself relates, quote, I went back to ancient doctrines like a delighted child, going from discovery to discovery, from treasure to treasure, from marvel to marvel. I recognized and loved this Christian past, its beauty not unworthy of the God whom it had honored with its liturgy, cathedrals, and theologies. It was in me as flesh of my flesh, soul of my soul, heart of my heart, and I did not know it. Once discovered, fixing the gaze of my spirit upon the holy fathers and doctors, upon the Clements and the Dionysi, the Gregories, the Augustines, and the Thomases, I said, I too am of their race, surely not by sanctity or genius, but by blood. Drinking in the freshness of the ages, I felt my Christian soul revive. End quote. It is evident from this remarkable profession that philosophy and theology could not but be inseparably linked in the thought and writing of this Christian Platonist. Thus it was in part the controversy resulting from the proclamation of the bodily assumption of Mary, the Mother of God, promulgated in 1950 by Pope Pius XII, which motivated Borella's doctoral dissertation in philosophy. As Borella explains, it was the almost universal disbelief and incomprehension with which this dogma was met, even in Catholic intellectual circles, that, quote, elicited from me what seemed to be a self-evident response. Beyond the divisions and oppositions of analytic reason stands the truth of the real, one with itself, inseparably both historical and symbolic, visible and invisible, physical and semantic. This self-evident response rested upon a kind of direct and sudden intuition, in which was revealed obscurely but without any possible doubt the ontologically spiritual nature of the matter of bodies, without for all that casting any doubt on the reality of their corporeity. End quote. I find these words to be singularly profound and suggestive of a philosophy which is at once rational in the highest sense and nonetheless authentically mystical as well. The more deeply one probes Borella's philosophical doctrine, the more one senses that its essential content derives from a single presiding insight which could only have been given in a direct and sudden intuition, a kind of gnosis, one can say. From the start, Borella has situated himself beyond the divisions and oppositions of analytic reason, on the unshakable ground of intellective vision. He is acutely cognizant of the fact that, on a mental plane, vision is perforce mediated by concepts, even as, on a sensory level, it is mediated by signs and symbols, be they natural or culturally instituted. With consummate with consummate clarity, he recognizes that we see through the sign, and therefore behold not the sign, but indeed its referent. And from the very outset of his philosophical inquiries, he appears to understand that the enigma of semanticity, meaning, derives in fact from the central mystery of Christianity, the mystery of the Logos, the Word that is God. In a remarkable discourse regarding language and thought, Borella takes as his starting point the provocative dictum of Condillac: science is only language well posed. Certainly Borella does not accept the thesis that science is no more than language by fate. He does, however, maintain that one may consider that property as the criterion of scienticity. This means that science, at least in the contemporary sense, is characterized by its use of language, by the logic, one can say, of its formal expression. What is it, then, that differentiates the scientific from the pre-scientific use of language? Borella begins his analysis by distinguishing categorically between thought and language. What is thought? It is a mental movement in quest of an object, he replies. Thought, therefore, is inherently oriented towards an objective referent by way of a concept, which Borella defines in scholastic terms as the form of an act by which the understanding intends an object. What we think, therefore, is always the object, even though we think the object by means of a concept. What, then, is language? One may characterize language by its function, which is to support, express, and communicate thought. Thought, therefore, has primacy. Having thus distinguished between thought and language, Borella goes on to observe that the question of truth, of coherence and non-contradiction, arises for both, but that the criteria of truth appropriate to these respective levels are vastly different. What matters on the plane of thought is what Borella terms l'ouverture à l'être. It's probably terrible pronunciation. That is, openness to being. The term of thought, the fulfillment of its quest, resides in the being of its objective referent. For thought, it is the transcendent object itself that counts, de jure. And this fundamental fact entails that the corresponding criteria of truth or coherence are ontological and interior. Verum index sui, says Spinoza. The case of language, on the other hand, is very much the opposite. Here, the criteria are perforce formal and exterior, a key recognition. For as Borella goes on to note, quote, there results a kind of inverse relation between the coherence of language and of thought. In effect, the more open the thought is to being, the less assured it is of the pertinence of its discourse, and the more the latter the discourse appears to it as inadequate. End quote. This decisive insight calls to mind the last didactic utterance of Thomas Aquinas, the mihi ut palia videtur, which translated is, to me appears like straw, which I guess, to me language appears like straw, which points beyond the bounds of his official doctrine. What presently concerns us, however, is something more specific. It follows, namely, from the aforesaid principle, that what we are wont to term scientific exactitude is to be purchased at a price. What is that price? It is none other than what Borella terms the epistemic closure of the concept, which consists in the elimination from the concept of everything that proves recalcitrant to linguistic or formal expression, and is epistemic in the sense that it characterizes the nature of scientific thought. What stands at issue is not in fact a reduction of the concept to language, which is impossible, but a renunciation on the part of the scientist of any knowledge concerning the essence of things. What the scientist relinquishes by virtue of epistemic closure is thus precisely the kind of knowing proper to philosophy as such. For indeed, what the philosopher seeks is a revelation of essence in an illuminative encounter with the being itself of the object, to put it in Borella's words. On the other hand, what the philosopher, for his part, renounces in a kind of speculative humility is, in fact, every conceivable closure of the concept in the face of its object. It appears that Alfred North Whitehead was speaking for philosophy as such when he declared exactness to be, quote, a fake. Guided from the start by a supra-rational intuition, which could well be termed a sense of wonder, the philosopher uses concepts as a means to the attainment of a supra-conceptual truth in a non-discursive act of contemplative